Okay? Because the process will not work in isolation. Okay? Tools don't work very well without process, and processes don't work unless it's in a context that supports it. Okay. So very briefly, we'll run through the process, and we're going to use that framework to interrogate the Philips lighting case study. They didn't explicitly follow this process, but it doesn't matter. The idea is to understand what the process can or can't do in terms of highlighting what happened in the case. So, you note here, no light bulb. No light bulb, yeah? But we didn't have a budget for graphics, so that's why there's no light bulb. But more importantly, it doesn't say idea, concept, or anything like that. Because if you look at the evidence, yeah, of innovations, you can very rarely track them back to the original idea or concept. And there are big legal battles and historical battles about who invented the jet engine and who invented this. And it's all great fun, yeah, jingoistic stuff, waving flags and everything. Big court cases over years, and often they're not resolved. Yeah, because often it's not a focal idea or concept and then something grows from it. It's the coming together, a sort of confluence of connections, which often at very similar times, albeit on different parts of the planet, yeah, come together and people realise there's a potential to do something new and interesting. So it's these connections which are important. And for that reason, the sort of verb, if you like, that we've used is not about idea generation or creativity. It's about search. Sometimes scanning, searching, I can't call it. It's been actively looking for what's possible. Yeah? And part of that's technology, part of it's markets, part of it's other things. Okay? So the key thing in this is a bundle of ways of trying to identify initially more sources of innovation and then to look for patterns or connections. Because most real innovations are the coming together of several streams. Okay? It's not a focal demographic or a focal piece of technology. Often it's several things coming together, which together is the combination that creates often the novelty and the value. Okay? So the verb there is about searching. So examples, again, I'm not going to go around this, but basically these are different sources, plural, of innovation. And often most organisations consider one or two. They might talk to their suppliers, yeah? They might have an internal knowledge management system or something, but they very rarely exhaust or explore the whole range of things. Some are more, yeah, inspiration's still there, it happens. But the trick, even with inspiration, is being sensitive to, so what? What can we do about it? And it's true, a lot of innovations you can track back to a accident, serendipity. Yeah? But the really interesting thing is, how did those guys then realise there was potentially something that was interesting from that? Because most people walk past these things. Yeah? So, right from invention of electricity and vulcanised rubber, a lot of these were accidents in the sense people were fiddling around and something happens that surprised them, and then they have to make sense of it. What could we do with that? Yeah? So the guys who discovered vulcanised rubber were looking for ways of making latex more stable, so it was a search, a focused search, but the way they did it in terms of spilling it on the hot plate was an accident. But the really interesting story is they missed the opportunity. They couldn't figure out what the point was. They changed its properties, but so what? What can we do with that next? Yeah? And it requires whole new people to come along and say, that has different properties. What could we do with that? Yeah? And you often get that disconnect because people aren't sensitized to even serendipity. What could happen next? The example of electricity, the first dry cells, batteries, like we've got in all our machines there. What were the first applications of not dry cells, wet cells, batteries? Invented in France, I think it's the last invention ever in France, was, well, edit that one out, no. But what were the first applications? The people who actually invented the first wet cells, first batteries. What do you think it was? Was it electrification of lights? No, they came a century later, something. It was circuses, electrocuting people at circuses for almost 22 years or something. They would take around big packs of these cells, and people from the audience come along and be electrocuted. Yeah? That was it. Nobody could figure out what to do with it. And so often these sort of innovations come along, and innovations, and people just don't know. So a lot of innovation is being sensitive to what does it do, and what could we do with that? And there's often a big disconnect, and often it's a different individual, a different group, or a different company that realises the potential of what's possible. So what we're trying to do is break that disconnection. Users, innovators, a big deal at the moment. There's lots of tools and techniques to try to internalise particularly things like online communities, trying to get expertise from those and internalise those and capture some of that knowledge, because often people participate on a voluntary basis. Some accidents we spoke about. Watching others, ethnographic studies. A lot of the big consultancies outfits, that's what they do. You write a big check, and they say, you want to innovate? Yes. What do you want? Give us a brief. And then they go watch people. Yeah? Like sort of, ethnographic anthropologists. They look around, watch people in their sort of natural environment, whether it be an office or a nursery or whatever.
Or like Samsung and iPhone.
Can you elaborate? I mean, we're going to talk about that later, so we don't want to start a fight too early, but it is a bit like religion and football teams, isn't it? How do you mean?
Samsung copied the technology of the iPhone, the screens,
No, I'm not talking. No, okay, good point. Okay, I get what you're saying. Okay, I'm not talking about. We're talking about imitation later. I'm not talking about imitation, legally or otherwise. We'll discuss that in the next session, actually. But we're talking about actually observing people, how they work, what they do, and how they might use an innovation in a real environment. So rather than in a lab or something. So observation. Recombinant innovation, a tedious term. That means it's not my diagram. Tedious term. It's called many other things, architectural innovation and all that sort of. Basically, it means what we've been talking about, seeing these connections. Yeah? A lot of innovations, I include things like the iPhone, are not new. You can literally decompose it into, say, well, that's 10 years old, operating system 24 years old, that screen somebody else developed, those chipsets are developed by ARM, they're built in Taiwan. But together, it's something really quite clever. Now, that's a physical example of that, but there are many other examples where innovations, this connection, seeing these new novel connections. And that's, I don't care what you call it, recombinant's a bit of a clumsy term, but a lot of innovation are these connections, seeing connections that others don't see, and then figuring out how you can create value from that. So expand the horizon beyond the sort of, it's all about ideas or R&D or creativity. And there are lots of techniques which we're not going to go into, they're all available, as we say, on the website. About the website, by the way, it's not a commercial break because the website doesn't generate any income. That's a bad move, wasn't it? But it's an open site, as you probably know if you had a look. You've got the links and the URL there. But the toolkit's getting bigger and bigger, and we've got about 100 tools now. And basically you can say, okay, I'm trying to figure out how I search for innovation, or I'm trying to figure out how I forecast, trying to figure out how I work with partners. And you can then begin to identify clusters of tools that might help you do that. Okay? But I repeat, without a process, tools don't work very well, and without organisational climate, the process doesn't work very well. But it's useful to say, well, how do I actually do this? And drill it down to a sort of toolkit. Okay, so how do we bring that all together? Well, going back to this idea of innovation strategy, really, is that given the range and sources of innovation, is to encourage a sort of, a large number of these inputs, and then to try to make sense of that. To have debate, which would go back to the climate issue. If you have too much consensus about how the world works and what's important, you miss stuff. Yeah? You either don't see it when it's out there, or you see it and you dismiss it. It's not relevant. Okay? And so being sensitive to what can be possible. So one is sensitization and applying these tools and techniques. Whole range of forecasting stuff. We don't worry about that. That's interesting because it fits my universal graph. So I ask you a question. You're seeking some technology externally because we're saying, look, don't necessarily have to reinvent this stuff. You need to search and look for it. So you're looking out there and trying to figure out how could we use some technology. So for example, I'll give you an example. Nintendo, Japanese games company, ... used to make playing cards. That's not relevant. That's just to keep you attentive. Nintendo's most successful product ever, to date anyway, was the Wii. Yeah, the current one's not so clever, but the previous Wii, for many reasons, it attracted non-gaming markets. It made money on consoles, not just games. A whole bunch of firsts. Yeah, so whether it's luck or not, we don't know yet because they haven't followed through, but it may have been. But some of the smart things they did in terms of segmenting non-users, that's very clever. But in terms of the technology, one of the things they did was to create an interface that was more intuitive. Yeah, so you didn't need gamers' thumbs and such like and lots of training. So that was a very clever thing. Now the downside was they didn't have the technical resources of their competitors, Sony and Microsoft, who have very deep technical pockets. So they had to try to develop or acquire a technology that could create this new interface for non-gamers. So what did they do? What did they do? Or what would you advise them to do based on our model? Yeah?
Open platform.
Open platform, but more precisely, what would you advise them based on our new singing or dancing process model? What would be your advice? Now, they don't have the R&D internally to do this.
Alliance.
Outsource is a sort of bit like saying automate. It's a sort of a nice envelope to get rid of the problem. Yeah.
Development community. Developer.
Looking for experts in the field of how to interact with an
Yeah,
activity.
you could, rather than, you're right, an alternative to set up a development community such that. But before you need to do that, there's a lot of stuff out there. Yeah? There's a whole reservoir, if that's the right, it's not the right terminology, but I've been watching The Return too much. Whole reservoir, okay, of technology, often unused or uncommercialized. So before you set up your own communities or outsource, trouble with outsourcing, you have to specify what you want, and by definition, you don't have the internal R&D to do it. So it becomes problematic. You know, you get this, what do they call it, moral hazard that suppliers do bad things. So you would look, you start to search out there, what's out there, what could help us and such like, yeah? So one of the many smart things they did was to identify technology they could use in this novel interface. And one of the things they spotted was in a different sector and in a different country. So it's doubly clever. Because if you look at the research, we tend to search locally. We search in our sector and often in our own country. You know, we have these huge biases about where we search. So they identified, for example, in the automotive sector that there were a range of suppliers who had lots of sensor technology that they developed over many years, which was very cheap, very high volume, and could be used in other applications. And after they filtered that down to several they could do business with, they identified one, Analog Components, who could supply for a few cents these motion sensors to be put into the controllers with a licensing agreement. Yeah? Didn't produce it, but the clever thing they did was to identify who could provide that technology and how it could be adapted. And that's different to doing lots of R&D. In some cases, the smart things to do on R&D. In some cases, it's the dumb thing to do. Yeah? So this is an example where they looked at where could we perhaps, not outsource, they haven't specified it, but where could we search and look for technology that could be adapted to our needs. Okay? And why that's relevant, and I hear you crying, why is he telling us these things? Because it fits our universal diagram here. Yeah, so if we have some idea, if this is some measure of the technological, that's very irritating, isn't it? So this is some measure of how far away it is from existing technology. So this is very close to current technology, and this is very far. Yeah? And if you look here, I just changed my dimensions. Isn't it good? You should get yourself one of these universal diagrams. You see that if you look at the research, often there's, again, a sweet spot. If technology is too close to existing technology, why do you think the returns are so low?
Because there are other alternatives.
Yeah, because there are many other alternatives, often which are cheaper and more proven and more compatible, etc., etc. So that sort of explains it down here, yeah? That often these things are marginally better, and depending on the regulatory environment, i.e. outside pharmaceuticals, then people aren't willing to pay or pay a premium for something that's that close. So why do you think the returns are, for very different reasons, very low when you start getting emerging technology?
It's too many kind of step. You're going to have trouble getting the innovators to adopt the new idea.
Yeah, there's issues of incompatibility, there's issues of adaptation, yeah. It could be high cost because it isn't debugged or hasn't been amortized across volume yet. Whole bunch of reasons, yeah. The cost of adaptation, the cost of debugging is so high that often the upsides aren't there. So again, there's a sweet spot where, okay, it's far enough away from what we're doing at the moment, often in a different sector, yeah, but we can see how we could adapt it, like the Nintendo example, and therefore we could solve a problem and connect up and generate some income, okay? So there are many ways, but one way, for example, would be how would you go about searching for external technology? I mean, how would you go about that? It's okay to say, no, I'll search for external technology, sort of look out the window. There's none out there. I mean, how would you do this in practice? If you drill down and say, we've got a gap in our development project we need to fill. How would you go about that?
Set up a team and do it internally or get consultants?
You could get a team, but how? What sort of tools or methods might you use? Who does it is not immaterial, but it's less important than how it's done. How would you go about that?
Examine adjacent industries.
Yeah, you could. You should be a consultant. Maybe you are a consultant. Examine adjacent industries. That sounds good. Let's go. The adjacent industries are being examined. Let's go. Yeah, which is what happens. I mean, if you're in one of my PhD students is looking at the PV industry, solar cells in Taiwan, and that's what they do. What they do is they get out their research facility and they walk across the road, the science park, and they ask guys in the semiconductor bit how they could fix it, and then they walk back and they do what the semiconductor guys have done. That's how far they go. Yeah, a few hundred meters across the road to the other science park, because that's what we do. We don't look in other sectors, so we're not Nintendo. We tend to look locally for the best fix. So you're right, people do that, yeah. But the adjacency is often a problem, a bit like benchmarking. Well, you can do things. It depends how people-based it. It could be conferences, conventions. God forbid, universities, if you have relationships with them. It could be more systematically, depending on the nature of technology. Patents. We're going to talk about patents later in terms of creating value through licensing and things. But you can use them for different purposes. You can identify technologies through looking at patent databases. Not fun, but somebody has to do it. Yeah? But you can begin to identify what's out there. Yeah? Because there are legal and financial checks on that. Some of it's really strange, but some of it's very interesting, a bit like the Nintendo example, where you have to specify what it does technically, and then you can step back and say, I could use that in a different application. Yeah? We can interrogate these databases quite fine grained. So that's one way you can go about doing that. Okay. Users, we said, other ways of identifying innovations. Let's not worry about that. Okay, so what we're saying is search is a much better way of thinking and practicing the early stages than thinking about ideas and creativity. It's very misleading. Okay, so where you search, how you search, what you're searching for. Sounds like a song, doesn't it? Okay, having searched, the problem is if you do this effectively, you will be overwhelmed by opportunities. Money back guarantee. Yeah, you'll be overwhelmed with what is possible, and so therefore you need to put more resources on being selective about. Okay, how do we filter these for things that we can actually execute and implement?